She came to the Plaza Hotel with a dress she couldn't afford to dry clean and a smile she'd been practicing in the bathroom mirror for 3 days. She told herself it was just 2 hours. 2 hours of pretending she belonged in a world like this, and the bank would leave her alone for another month. She was wrong about almost everything that night. The man, the game, the danger waiting for her behind a face she thought she recognized. But the moment that changed her life wasn't the orchestra or the champagne or even the man with the cold eyes who watched her from across the ballroom. It was the exact second Lorenzo Verciani leaned toward his friends, raised his glass, and laughed. Not at a joke. At her. If you were Clara Mitchell, what would you have done? Stay with this story until the very end. And if you're watching from a city or country you love, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit like, because there are more stories like this one coming, and you won't want to miss them. The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday. Clara didn't open it right away. She set it on the counter beside the register, beneath the ceramic rooster her father had bought at a flea market in 1987, and she finished serving Mrs. Geraldo her usual 2 croissants and a black coffee before she let herself look at the envelope again. She already knew what was inside. She'd known for 6 weeks, ever since the quarterly payment bounced and the loan officer stopped returning her calls. Still, she tore the envelope open slowly, the way you peel a bandage. Not because it hurts less that way, but because you want to stay in the moment before you know for certain. 90 days. Mitchell's Patisserie had 90 days before the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings on the building her father had spent 22 years paying off. Clara folded the letter once, put it in her apron pocket, and went back to the kitchen to check on the morning's second batch of honey cake. Her father had named the bakery when Clara was 4 years old, back when the neighborhood was different and people still bought bread from places with handwritten signs. Bernard Mitchell had been a big-shouldered man who smelled of sugar and flour and worked 16-hour days without complaint. He told Clara once that a bakery wasn't a business. It was an argument, a daily argument that the world could still hold something warm. He died of a stroke 8 years ago, behind that exact same counter, still wearing his apron. Clara had been 26. She took over the shop, kept the prices the same, kept the hours the same, kept the ceramic rooster on the counter. She made every recipe from his handwritten notebooks, the ones with the yellow pages and the grease stains and the margins full of his cramped, careful notes. For a while, it almost worked. Then the building 2 doors down became a luxury condo development. Then the rent on commercial property in the neighborhood doubled, then tripled. Then a new artisan bakery opened on the corner with a minimalist interior and a logo designed by someone who charged $800 for the concept, and people who'd bought from Clara's father for 20 years started drifting away, one by one, the way people do when something shinier appears. Clara had taken out a second loan to cover the operational gap, then a third. Then she'd stopped sleeping more than 5 hours a night and started rationing her own meals so she could make payroll for her one remaining employee, a 73-year-old woman named Rosa, who had worked with her father and who Clara would sooner set herself on fire than let go. So when the flyer appeared in her inbox, that forwarded by a friend of a woman she'd met at a neighborhood business association meeting, Clara read it 3 times before she understood what it was. Elite social arrangements, curated introductions for high-profile individuals, compensated companionship for private events. At the bottom, in smaller text, evening engagements, 2 to 4 hours, minimum guaranteed compensation of $2,000 per arrangement. Clara had sat at her kitchen table for 45 minutes staring at that number. $2,000 was 6 weeks of Rosa's salary. $2,000 was the cost of the commercial oven repair she'd been delaying for 4 months. $2,000 was not salvation, but it was air. Just enough of it to keep breathing. She told herself it was just a charity gala. Wealthy men use services like this all the time, for professional events where showing up with someone appropriate mattered more than actually knowing the person. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was performing a service. She was a professional accompaniment. She wore her mother's silver gown, let out at the waist 3 years ago, taken in at the shoulders 6 months after that. She did her own hair. She practiced what to say when asked what she did for a living, deciding on something vague, food industry, that was technically accurate and required no elaboration. She walked into the Plaza Hotel, telling herself she was in control. She believed it right up until the moment she saw the look on Lorenzo Verciani's face. He was standing near the top of the stairs when she arrived, the kind of man who positioned himself where he could be seen from every angle. He was beautiful in the way expensive things were beautiful. Polished, precise, assembled for maximum effect. Dark suit, dark eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been drawn by someone who'd studied the concept of authority. He watched her cross the lobby and he smiled, and the smile was friendly enough that Clara almost relaxed. "Miss Mitchell." He took her hand, not shook it, took it. "You look exactly as I was told you would." She didn't know what that meant. She filed it away. The evening began in a way she hadn't expected, smoothly. Lorenzo was charming in a performative way, the kind of charming that required an audience, and there was always an audience. He introduced her to people whose names she'd seen in newspaper headlines, asked her questions that seemed thoughtful until she realized he wasn't actually listening to her answers. He was watching other people watch her. She began to understand, a prop. It irritated her, but it was a manageable irritation. She knew how to be in a room where she didn't belong. She'd been doing it her whole life, in parent-teacher conferences at private schools where she was on scholarship, at culinary events where the other attendees had trust funds, and her hands were the only thing in the room with calluses. She adjusted. She endured. But then the group around Lorenzo thickened. 4 men in suits, all with the same studied ease of people who had never had to think about money. And Lorenzo said something low that Clara didn't catch. And one of the men laughed, and another one pulled out his phone and appeared to be checking something. And Lorenzo glanced at her with an expression that she would spend the next several hours trying to correctly name. Amusement. That was part of it. But there was also appraisal. The way you look at something you've purchased, checking if it arrived in the condition described. She excused herself to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror for 2 full minutes, hands braced on the edge of the sink. "Stop it," she told herself. "Take the money. Go home. Pay Rosa." She went back out. That was when she saw the second man. He came in from the side entrance, and the room changed when he entered. Not loudly, not the way rooms change for people who want to be noticed. It changed the way a room changes when the temperature drops. People didn't turn to look at him. They became aware of him the way you become aware of a draft, a pressure shift, something in the air that your body registers before your mind does. Clara noticed him because he was standing absolutely still in a room full of movement. He had the same face as Lorenzo. The exact same face. Same jaw, same height, same dark eyes. But everything else was different in a way that was difficult to quantify. Where Lorenzo's expressions changed constantly, performing, calculating, performing again. This man's face was quiet. Not empty. Quiet. Like something that has decided it doesn't need to speak to be understood. He saw her. Not the way Lorenzo had seen her. Not as a prop. Not as a variable in whatever game was being played. He looked at her the way you look at something that doesn't fit, when you're trying to figure out why. Then he looked at Lorenzo, and his expression changed just slightly, just at the corners of his eyes, and Clara couldn't read it, but she knew instinctively that it was not a good expression. It was the expression of a man who has seen something happen that he was not warned about and does not approve of. Lorenzo crossed the room toward his twin, and they exchanged words Clara couldn't hear. Lorenzo's posture was relaxed, almost theatrical. The other man's was not. He said something short and direct, and Lorenzo laughed. Actually laughed, the sound carrying across the nearest cluster of guests. And said something back that made the other man go very still. Rosa had a phrase she used when a situation turned. She'd say, "The wind shifted. The wind shifted." The other man looked at Clara again. This time, he walked toward her. She stood her ground, which she would later consider a small miracle, given the fact that she was fairly certain her heart was doing something structurally unsound. "My name is Alessandro Verciani," he said. His voice was quieter than she expected. Controlled. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding that I would like to address." "Your brother assigned me as his date for the evening," Clara said. She was proud of how steady her voice was. "If that's the misunderstanding, I'm already aware of it." Something moved in his eyes. "That's not the misunderstanding I mean." He offered his hand, an actual handshake, formal, deliberate. She took it. "I think," he said, "that you should dance with me." It was not quite a question, but it was not the kind of statement Lorenzo would have made either. It didn't assume. It waited. "I don't really dance," Clara said. Neither do I, Alessandro said, but I need to keep you visible and in conversation until I can get you out of this room, and standing here talking is going to draw the wrong kind of attention. She stared at him. Miss Mitchell, he said, I'm telling you directly because I don't have time to be subtle. My brother brought you here tonight as part of a bet. The specifics are ugly, and I would rather explain them somewhere that isn't surrounded by the people who placed it. The orchestra was playing something from a different century. Guests moved in slow circles around them. Lorenzo was watching from across the room with an expression Clara finally knew how to name. He was waiting to see what she would do. She took Alessandro's arm. They moved onto the dance floor, and she kept her shoulders back because she was her father's daughter, and Bernard Mitchell had not raised her to let anyone see her flinch. Alessandro's hand settled at her waist. Correct distance, no closer than necessary, and she noticed the precision of it, the way she noticed the precision of everything about him. What was the bet? She said. Not a question, a demand. He looked at her for a moment. $50,000, he said. The terms were that he could make you fall for him inside of one evening. The men with him are the ones who took the other side. The music moved around them. He researched you, Alessandro continued, and his voice didn't soften for it, which she appreciated more than she could explain. Your bakery's finances, the loans. He chose you specifically because he believed someone in your situation would be, he paused, easier to manage. Clara's jaw was tight. She was aware of the tightness, and she let it stay because the alternative was something worse. How do you know I won't just go over there and say something that ruins his evening, she said. Because you're smart, Alessandro said, and because the men in this room who lost money on that bet have short tempers and long memories, and I would like you to leave this event tonight with no additional complications in your life. She looked at him. You don't know anything about my life. I know about the bakery, he said. I know about the second and third loans. I know you've been making payroll by cutting your own salary for, he paused, 14 months. The music swelled slightly, and they turned, and Clara kept her face composed and thought, with a cold clarity, that she had walked into a room full of people who knew exactly who she was before she arrived, and not one of them had told her. Lorenzo told you, she said. Yes. Because it was part of the research. Yes. She let out a breath through her nose. Slow, controlled. The way she used to breathe in the kitchen when the oven temperature was wrong and she had 30 minutes until service and no backup plan. Not panicking, just recalibrating. What happens now? She said. Now, Alessandro said. We finish this dance. Then I walk you to the car I have waiting, and we get you away from this room. And Lorenzo? His hand tightened slightly at her back, just once, and then it released. Lorenzo is my problem, he said. The song ended. He did not release her immediately. He stood with her at the edge of the dance floor while the applause scattered around them, and for exactly 3 seconds he looked at her with something she didn't have a name for. Not sympathy, not calculation, something that sat between those two things and had its own texture entirely. Then he said very quietly, I'm sorry this happened to you. And Clara Mitchell, who had not cried in front of another person in 4 years, had to look away and press her teeth together hard enough to feel it. She had come here to survive 2 hours. She was starting to understand the night was just beginning. The car was already running when they came out of the side entrance, not the front. Alessandro had steered her through a service corridor behind the ballroom, past a startled server carrying a tray of champagne flutes, through a door that opened onto a narrow street still slick from earlier rain. Clara didn't ask how he knew where the service door was. She was starting to understand that Alessandro Verciani knew the exits of every room he entered before he walked in. The vehicle was black, heavy, the kind of SUV that didn't exist in the price range of anyone Clara had ever known. A man in a dark jacket opened the rear door without being asked. Alessandro waited for her to get in first. She did. The door closed and the city disappeared behind tinted glass. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The driver pulled into traffic, and Alessandro looked out the window, and Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her mother's silver gown pooling around her feet, and she thought, with a strange dissociation, that this was the most expensive car she had ever been inside, and she had no idea where it was going. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere quieter," he said, still watching the window. "That's not an answer." He looked at her then. "My building, 12 blocks. If you want me to drop you at your address instead, I will. Your building, she repeated. I have a private floor. There are staff present at all times. You'll be... He stopped, started again. I'm not in the habit of explaining myself, but I understand why that sounds like something you shouldn't agree to, so I'm telling you, it's the safest option right now. Lorenzo will expect you to go home. I'd rather he not know where you are for the next hour while I make a few calls. Clara looked at him for a long moment. His face in the dark of the car was harder to read than it had been under the chandeliers. The lines of it were the same as Lorenzo's and completely different. Same architecture, different weather. Fine, she said. He nodded once and went back to the window. She lasted about 90 seconds. The $50,000, she said. Was that real? That's what the bet was actually for? Yes. And the men who took the other side of it, they were betting against Lorenzo, that he couldn't... She stopped. The words tasted wrong. That he couldn't make me fall for him. Yes. So they knew too. Everyone in that circle knew what I was walking into. Alessandro was quiet for a second. Yes. Clara breathed in slowly, out slowly. The way she did when the morning rush went wrong and 2 ovens were behind and a wholesale order was late, and she had to decide in real time what to save and what to let burn. Priority, sequence. Don't feel it until later. How did he find me specifically, she said. The service you used, Elite Social Arrangements. He said the name without expression. Lorenzo has a contact there. He'd been looking for a particular profile. Someone with verifiable financial pressure. Someone without connections to the families. Someone who could be made to look. He chose the word carefully. Eager. The car moved through a yellow light. He wanted someone who'd perform, Clara said. Flat. Not a question. He wanted someone he could win with, Alessandro said. Lorenzo doesn't gamble unless the odds are engineered. She stared at the back of the driver's seat. The leather was stitched in a pattern so precise it looked like it had been done by machine. It probably had been. Everything in this world was precise and stitched and designed to look effortless by people whose entire job was making sure things looked effortless. He went through my loan history, she said. Yes. He knew about my father. Alessandro didn't answer immediately, and the pause was its own kind of answer. What did he know? She said. Her voice was quieter now. The bakery's history. How you inherited it. A pause. The circumstances of your father's death. Something moved through Clara's chest. Not grief. Something older than grief. Something that lived underneath it. The specific fury of having a loss turned into leverage by someone who had never earned the right to know about it. He used my father, she said. He used the information, Alessandro said, to calibrate the approach, to know what buttons to push if the evening needed. Adjustment. To know how desperate I was. Yes. The car stopped. They were in front of a building that didn't announce itself. No signage, no awning, just dark glass and a doorman who stepped forward the moment the vehicle arrived. Clara didn't move for a moment. You could have told me all of this in the ballroom, she said. No, Alessandro said. I couldn't. Why? Because Lorenzo was watching every exit. If I'd said any of that to you in the room and you'd reacted, which you would have because you're not the kind of person who doesn't react, he would have escalated. There are people in that building whose interest you don't want, and Lorenzo knows exactly how to direct that interest if he thinks it will cause problems for me. Clara turned to look at him fully. So you were also protecting yourself. Something in his expression shifted, not defensiveness, something more honest than that. Yes, he said. I was. She appreciated it. The admission. She'd expected deflection. She'd gotten clarity. It didn't make the situation better, but it made him easier to trust, which was its own uncomfortable problem. She got out of the car. The private elevator opened directly into a floor that felt less like an apartment and more like a building that had decided to become a room. High ceilings, dark wood. The furniture was expensive in the way that didn't advertise itself, chosen by someone who understood quality rather than someone who wanted to display it. A woman appeared immediately, 50s, silver hair pulled back, the careful composure of someone who had spent decades navigating complicated situations without showing any of it. She looked at Clara with absolutely no surprise. Mr. Versiani, she said. Should I prepare something? Coffee, Alessandro said. And, he glanced at Clara, have you eaten? Clara opened her mouth to say yes, and then remembered that she hadn't eaten since a piece of toast at 6 that morning because she'd been doing inventory and lost track of time. No, she said, against her better judgment. Whatever's available, Alessandro told the woman, who nodded and disappeared. He gestured toward the seating area, and Clara sat, mostly because her feet hurt, and the silver gown was not designed for the amount of adrenaline the evening had required. Alessandro remained standing. He took off his jacket and set it on the back of a chair and rolled up his left sleeve, checking something on his watch. Not the time, she realized, but some kind of notification. His phone was already in his hand. Give me 10 minutes, he said. Take 20, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. The ghost of a reaction that had forgotten how to fully form. He walked to the far side of the room and made his call with his back to her. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. The posture said enough, shoulders set, head slightly forward, the controlled stillness of someone delivering instructions rather than having a conversation. Whoever was on the other end was not a peer. The coffee arrived. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup and let herself feel the warmth of it, and looked out the window at the city below, and she thought about the letter in her apron pocket back at the bakery, which was where her apron was, which was where her real life was, and which she was going to return to whether the evening resolved cleanly or not. She thought about her father's recipe notebooks, the ones in the cabinet below the register, wrapped in a cloth the way he'd always kept them. She thought about the morning he'd shown her how to make the honey cake, not read her the recipe, showed her, standing behind her with his big hands over hers, talking her through the temperature of the butter, the way the sugar needed to dissolve before you added anything else, the sound the batter made when it was right. She was thinking about this when Alessandro came back. He sat down across from her, elbows on knees, and she saw for the first time that he looked tired. Not dramatically. It wasn't on the surface. It was in the tension of the muscles around his eyes, the slight flatness behind his expression. Lorenzo knows you're not at the hotel, he said. How? He would have expected you to leave after speaking with me. He's had someone watching the exits. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd report traffic. He doesn't know where you are, but he'll be... He chose his word again. I was a man who chose his words. Reactive. Reactive how? Alessandro picked up his own coffee and didn't drink it, just held it. Lorenzo doesn't lose gracefully, he said. He never has. When something doesn't go the way he planned, he redirects the failure onto whoever he can make responsible for it. He's going to blame me for leaving. He's going to need to do something that makes it clear he wasn't beaten by a bakery owner from Brooklyn, Alessandro said, and the bluntness of it was not unkind. I don't know yet what form that takes. Clara set her cup down. Is he dangerous? Alessandro looked at her steadily. In the way a petulant man with resources and no conscience is dangerous, yes. And you? A pause. I'm dangerous in other ways. I'm going to need a more specific answer than that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I run a business that operates in spaces where the law is approximate. The Versiani name carries weight in this city that isn't entirely built on legitimate enterprise. That's as direct as I'm willing to be with someone I've known for 90 minutes. Fair, Clara said. But I want you to understand, he said, and his voice changed slightly. Not softer, but more deliberate. What was done to you tonight was done without my knowledge and against everything I would permit. That matters to me. Not because it's good for my reputation, because it was wrong. Clara looked at him for a long time. You're very serious, she said finally. Yes. Your brother is very not. Yes, he said again, and this time there was something in it. Not humor, but the shape of where humor might have lived once, before whatever had replaced it. Her phone buzzed. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered it because she'd given the bakery's emergency line to Rosa as a forwarding number, and Rosa was 73 and worked early mornings, and any call after 11 at night was not a social call. Hello? The voice on the other end was not Rosa. Miss Mitchell. Male. Smooth. The voice of someone who had practiced sounding reasonable. I hope the evening treated you well. I'm calling on behalf of a client who has an interest in the property at a pause, and then her bakery's address, spoken precisely. Clara's stomach dropped. Who is this? She said. A representative, the voice said. My client has been made aware that the property is approaching a period of financial vulnerability and would like to make a preemptive offer before the bank's process begins. Given the timeline, it's 11:30 at night, Clara said. My client keeps unconventional hours, the voice said pleasantly. The offer is generous. It would clear your outstanding obligations entirely and provide additional capital for relocation. She was on her feet without knowing when she'd stood up. Tell your client, Miss Mitchell, the voice interrupted, still pleasant, still smooth. I would encourage you to consider the offer seriously before declining. The property will be considerably more difficult to negotiate for once foreclosure proceedings begin. My client is offering you a way out. That's a rare thing. Alessandro was watching her from across the room. She didn't know what her face was doing, but it was apparently enough, because he was already standing. I'm not interested, she said, and ended the call. Her hand was shaking, just slightly. She pressed it flat against her thigh. Someone just tried to buy my bakery, she said, at 11:30 at night, 20 minutes after I left a party where everyone knew my financial situation. Alessandro's expression went very still. What number called you? She showed him the screen. He looked at it, and something moved through his face that she wasn't equipped to read. It was too fast, too layered. That number belongs to a shell company Lorenzo used last year to acquire a property in the meatpacking district, he said. The owner had refused to sell. There was pressure applied. The room was very quiet. He moved fast, Clara said. He was already prepared, Alessandro said. The call was likely staged before you even arrived at the hotel tonight. Contingency. If the bet worked, he had a story. If it didn't, he stopped. He still won, Clara said. He gets the building either way. Alessandro put his phone down on the table. No, he said. He doesn't. You can't. I'm going to pay the debt, he said. Not loudly. Not as a declaration. The way you state a decision that's already been made. All 3 loans. In full. Tomorrow morning. Before any offer from Lorenzo's representative is formally documented. Clara stared at him. I'm not taking your money. It's not a gift, he said. It's a correction. Lorenzo used resources and access to engineer a situation that harmed you. I'm correcting it. That's the same thing with different vocabulary. No, he said, and the patience in his voice had an edge now. A gift is given. This is owed. You walked into a situation that my family created without your knowledge or consent. The financial consequence of that is my responsibility. Your brother's responsibility. My family, he said. My responsibility. She looked at him, at the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes, and the way he stood like someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions that cost something and had learned not to flinch at the price. She wanted to say no. Every independent, struggling, her father's daughter part of her wanted to say no. She said, I want a loan, not a payment, a loan with terms that I will repay. Something in his face settled. Agreed, he said. I'll need that in writing. By morning, he said. She sat back down. Her legs were tired. The silver gown had a small tear near the hem from where she'd caught it on the service door, and she hadn't noticed it until now. She reached for her coffee, cold. She drank it anyway. Why are you doing this? She said. Not suspiciously, genuinely. Alessandro sat down across from her again. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, When I was 8 years old, my father made a business decision that destroyed a man's livelihood, a man who had done nothing wrong. My father considered it a necessary casualty. He picked up his own cold coffee and looked at it. I've spent 30 years trying to run this family in a way that doesn't create that kind of casualty. Tonight, my brother created one, and she's sitting in front of me. Clara didn't say anything. Outside, the city went on being the city, sirens somewhere, the low, constant sound of traffic that never fully stopped. Her phone buzzed again. Different number this time. Rosa's number. She answered it fast. Rosa. Rosa's voice was not the voice of a 73-year-old woman calling to chat. It was the voice of someone who had just run somewhere, breathless and ragged at the edges. Clara. Gasp. Clara, you need to come. You need to come right now. What happened? The bakery. Another breath. There's a fire, baby. It's bad. The whole front is... Her voice broke. I tried to call the fire department already. They're coming, but Clara was on her feet. The coffee cup hit the floor. Alessandro caught her arm before she reached the elevator, not to stop her, to move with her. He was already on his phone, already talking to the driver, already in motion beside her before she'd finished processing what was happening. And she thought wildly, distantly, that this was what it looked like when someone actually helped instead of just offering to. The elevator doors opened and they stepped in, and Clara pressed both hands flat against the metal wall and breathed through her nose and thought about the recipe notebooks in the cabinet below the register, the ones with the yellow pages and her father's cramped, careful handwriting in the margins. And she thought, please, not those, not those. The doors closed. The car was waiting. The fire had already taken the front windows by the time the car turned onto the block. Clara saw it from half a street away. The orange push of light against the dark buildings around it. The way the flames moved with a kind of terrible patience, not explosive but consuming. The way a fire moves when it has been given enough time to settle in and decide it's staying. The street was blocked by 2 fire trucks and a police barrier and a small cluster of neighbors who had come out in coats thrown over pajamas, standing the way people stand when something is happening that they can't stop and can't look away from. Alessandro was out of the car before it fully stopped. Clara was faster. She went past the barrier without thinking about it, past a firefighter who called something at her back, past the heat threshold where the air changed quality and stopped being air and started being something you had to push through. She could see the front of the bakery, the window where her father had put the display case 40 years ago, where she'd arranged the morning pastries every day at 5:30 a.m. since she was 16 years old. And it was wrong. The glass was gone. The frame was char. The wooden sign with Mitchell's patisserie and the dark green letters her father had painted himself, the letters she had repainted herself twice in 20 years, was a black smear in the smoke. She was 20 feet from the door when Alessandro caught her. Not grabbed. Caught. His arm across her front, solid, and she hit it hard and pushed against it, and he didn't move. "The notebooks," she said. Her voice didn't sound like her voice. "The cabinet. They're in the cabinet. I need... Clara!" His mouth was near her ear. She could feel the heat of his breath against her face and the heat of the fire against everything else. "Clara, stop. They're the only copies. Stop." The word was flat and final, and she felt it in her sternum. The ceiling in the front room is already compromised. If you go in there, you don't come back out. She stopped pushing, not because she agreed, because her body registered something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. The sound of the structure, the low groan of it from somewhere above the smoke, the way the fire crackled with a wet quality that meant it had reached something it shouldn't have. She stopped. Alessandro kept his arm where it was for 3 more seconds, and she stood inside that constraint and breathed and felt the heat on her face and watched the place her father had built burn, and she didn't make a sound because there was no sound sufficient for what she was feeling, and so she made none. Rosa was 20 feet to their left, wrapped in a coat that wasn't hers, sitting on the hood of a parked car with her hands clasped in her lap. When she saw Clara, she stood up and crossed the distance fast for a woman her age, and Clara met her halfway, and they stood with their arms around each other while the fire department worked, and the smoke thickened and the night went on being wrong. "I was inside when I smelled it," Rosa said against Clara's hair. "I was doing the morning prep, early. I knew the oven timings were off yesterday, and I came in early to fix them." Her voice was shaking but controlled. "It didn't start in the kitchen, Clara. I know what a kitchen fire smells like. This started in the front." Clara pulled back and looked at her. "The front door," Rosa said. "Something accelerant. The smell was... it was chemical. It wasn't ours." Alessandro was behind Clara. She felt him there without turning around. "You're sure?" she said to Rosa. Rosa's eyes were 73 years old, and they had seen enough things to know the difference between an accident and a decision. "I'm sure," she said. Clara turned around. Alessandro was already on his phone. His expression was the one she was starting to recognize. Not anger on the surface, something under the surface that was far more controlled and far more dangerous than anger. Find out who was in the area in the last 3 hours, he said to whoever was on the other end. Full perimeter, and pull the traffic cameras on the cross streets. He paused. I don't care what time it is. He ended the call and looked at Clara. She said, It was Lorenzo. I don't have confirmation yet. You don't need confirmation, she said. You already know. He held her gaze. His jaw worked once, a small movement, the only crack in the composure. Yes, he said. I know. The fire was brought under control by 2 in the morning. The structure was standing, barely, the firefighter told her, and the word barely did its own particular damage. The front room was a loss. The kitchen had taken smoke damage and water damage and some structural impact from the ceiling in the rear. The cabinet below the register, where the notebooks were. The cabinet's intact, the firefighter said. He was a big man, soot on his face, speaking to her directly in the way that people speak when they know the news is mixed and they want to give the good part clearly, so it lands. The fire didn't get to the back wall. Your kitchen equipment is probably salvageable, but you'll need a full inspection before anyone goes back in. Clara stood in the street in her mother's silver gown, which now had soot along the hem and a smell that would never fully wash out. And she thought about the notebooks sitting in their cabinet, unburned. And she felt something complicated that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite fury, but had elements of all three. Alessandro appeared at her shoulder. There's nothing more you can do here tonight, he said. I live above the bakery, she said. A pause. I know. My apartment is on the 2nd floor. The structural inspection includes the residential space. You can't go up there until it's cleared. He said it without softening it, because she'd already established that she preferred that. You need to come with me. She looked at the building, at the black framing where the window had been, at the fire department's remaining truck and the investigator who was already walking the perimeter with a flashlight, pausing at the doorframe, crouching down. She looked at Rosa. She comes too, Clara said. Alessandro didn't hesitate. Of course. They put Rosa in the front seat with the driver, who turned out to be a quiet man named Dante, who produced a wool blanket from somewhere and handed it to Rosa without being asked. Clara sat in the back with Alessandro, and the city moved past the windows, and she looked at none of it. Tell me what you're going to do, she said. Tonight I'm going to get confirmation, he said. Tomorrow I'm going to deal with it. Deal with it how? He looked at her. That's not a conversation for tonight. I'm not asking out of concern for Lorenzo, she said. I'm asking because I want to know what I'm part of. If I'm part of something, I want to understand it. He was quiet for a long moment. The city moved. Rosa murmured something to Dante in the front, and Dante responded in a voice so low it was only texture. Lorenzo has been a problem for a long time, Alessandro said finally. Not just for you. He makes moves that compromise the stability of what I've built, and then he expects the name to absorb the consequences. Last year, it was a deal he made with a family from Philadelphia that nearly started something that would have cost lives. The year before, a business associate who had to be quietly relocated because Lorenzo had made threats that couldn't be walked back. He looked out the window. I've managed it. Because he's family, and because managing it was easier than the alternative. Tonight changed that, Clara said. Tonight he burned a building, Alessandro said, with a woman inside. The weight of that sentence sat in the car. Rosa, Clara said. Rosa, he confirmed. She looked at her hands. The silver of the gown caught the passing streetlights and threw small, cold reflections across the back of the seat. She thought about Lorenzo standing at the top of the stairs, watching her cross the lobby with that engineered smile, and she thought about the phone call at 11:30, the smooth voice talking about preemptive offers, and she thought about the fire investigator crouching at the doorframe with his flashlight, pausing, because something was there that shouldn't be. He hadn't just tried to ruin her. He'd planned it. The whole sequence. The bet, the call, the fire. A complete architecture of destruction built around one woman who owed money and had no one powerful enough to protect her. She had been selected specifically because she was alone. I want to be useful, she said. Alessandro looked at her. I'm not going to sit in your building and wait while you manage this, she said. I'm not going to be the thing that happened to you that you're handling. I need a purpose. I need something I can do. What do you want to do? He said. Not skeptical, actually asking. I want to make breakfast, she said. He blinked. Just one once. It was the most surprised she'd seen him look. Your kitchen, she said. The one in your building that I'm guessing gets used approximately never, because you don't strike me as a man who cooks. I want to use it. In the morning. I need to be somewhere that functions, and I need to do something with my hands, or I'm going to come apart, and I'm not willing to come apart right now. Alessandro looked at her for a moment. The kitchen is yours, he said. She nodded, turned back to the window. She was going to come apart anyway. She knew that. It was going to happen when she was alone, in whatever guest room she was put in, and it was going to be ugly and private and complete. But that was later. That was for later. The Versiani building at night was different from what she'd seen of it in the evening. The staff had thinned. The lights were lower. Alessandro showed her a guest room that was larger than her entire apartment and had a bathroom with a heated floor, and she stood in the doorway and looked at it with the specific vertigo of someone who has had a very long night. Rosa's down the hall, he said. Dante will stay on this floor. You're worried Lorenzo will come here, she said. No, he said. This building is secure. I'm worried you'll try to leave at 4 a.m. to go check on the notebooks yourself. She looked at him. He was not entirely wrong. Sleep, he said. Whatever needs to be fought, we fight it rested. He left. She listened to his footsteps go down the hall and a door close somewhere. She sat on the edge of the bed and took off her shoes and looked at the tear in the hem of the silver gown and thought about her father, and then she stopped thinking about her father because if she started, she wouldn't stop, and she needed to stop. She slept 4 hours. She didn't dream, which was a mercy. At 6 in the morning, she found the kitchen. It was exactly what she'd expected. Large, professional-grade equipment, pristine, the refrigerator stocked by someone who understood the concept of food, but not the concept of cooking it. She found eggs, butter, a half-used bag of flour that had been there long enough to be slightly past its ideal date, but not long enough to be a problem. Dried herbs, good olive oil, an onion that was still solid. She made a frittata. She wasn't thinking about the frittata while she made it. She was thinking about the sequence of the night, the phone call, the fire, the investigator at the doorframe. She was building a picture of what Lorenzo had done and in what order, and the picture had a shape to it that bothered her. He'd moved too fast. The call had come 20 minutes after she left the hotel. The fire had started around the same time, which meant it had been set before the call, which meant Lorenzo hadn't been waiting to see whether she took the offer. He'd already decided she wouldn't. He'd already decided what he was going to do. The offer hadn't been an offer. It had been a notification. This is what has already happened, and here is the only exit available to you. She was pressing this thought flat with the back of a spatula when Alessandro came into the kitchen. He stopped in the doorway. He was in different clothes, dark trousers, a shirt that wasn't fully buttoned, the first time she'd seen him look like something other than assembled. His hair was not quite right. He had the specific texture of a man who had not slept at all. He looked at the stove. At her. At the stove again. Sit down, she said. It's almost ready. He sat down at the kitchen table, a long, dark table that she suspected had never had food on it. And he sat with his elbows on the surface and his hands loosely clasped. And he looked like someone who was carrying something very heavy and had just found somewhere to set it down temporarily. She put the frittata in front of him. Cut 2 pieces. Put one in front of him and kept one for herself and sat across from him, and they ate. He didn't say it was good. He just ate it, the way a person eats when they're hungry and the food is real. And Clara thought that was a more complete compliment than anything he could have said. Halfway through, he said, the traffic cameras confirmed a vehicle matching Lorenzo's secondary car in the block behind the bakery at 11:03. The fire investigators' preliminary finding is accelerant along the exterior front wall, consistent with deliberate origin. She set down her fork. So, we have him. We have evidence of his involvement. What we do with it depends on several things. You're not going to the police, she said. He looked at her. Would that be your preference? My preference is that it's a real option, she said. Is it? It's complicated, he said. Uncomplicate it for me. He looked at his plate for a moment. If I go to the police with evidence against Lorenzo, I expose the processes by which that evidence was gathered. That opens other questions. Questions that implicate people who have nothing to do with your bakery and everything to do with the way my business operates. The investigation that would follow Lorenzo would not stop with Lorenzo. It would get to you, she said. It would get to people who have served this family loyally for a long time and who don't deserve to be buried by Lorenzo's garbage, he said. And then, quieter. Yes, it would get to me. Clara folded her hands on the table. So what's the play? She said. Internal, he said. Lorenzo is brought before the council of the families. His actions are documented. His standing is addressed. Addressed? Removed, he said. Completely. She nodded slowly. And the bakery? I'm rebuilding it, he said. Full restoration. Better than it was, structurally. Your kitchen equipment will be replaced with equivalent or better. The front room will be restored to its original design. He said it the same way he'd said everything. Not as a gift. As a matter of being corrected. The notebooks are in the cabinet. They're intact. I've already arranged for a courier to retrieve them and bring them here this morning. She looked at him. You sent someone for them before you even had breakfast, she said. He met her eyes. You told me last night they were the only copies, he said. She sat with that for a moment. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, and it fell across the table between them, and she thought about her father and the way he'd looked when he talked about what a bakery was. A daily argument that the world could still hold something warm. She thought maybe she was starting to understand what he meant. I'm not going to leave, she said. Alessandro looked at her. I mean, I'm not going to take the loan and disappear and rebuild quietly and stay out of your way, she said. Whatever's happening with Lorenzo, I want to be present for it. I want to face him. I want him to know what he burned. Alessandro was quiet for a moment. That's not safe, he said. I know. Clara, I know, she said again, harder. I'm not asking you to make it safe. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. He looked at her for a long time. The morning light moved slightly as a cloud passed somewhere above the city. From down the hall came the muffled sound of Rosa's television, the 6 o'clock news she watched every day without fail. There's an event in 3 weeks, Alessandro said slowly. The Winter Gala. Every significant figure in this world will be present. If Lorenzo is going to be formally confronted, it will happen there, publicly, in front of everyone whose opinion constrains him. He stopped. It would be useful to have you there, as a witness to what he did, as evidence in human form of the kind of damage he causes without consequence. You want me to walk into another party, she said. I want you to walk into the room where Lorenzo has to account for what he did, he said, with me beside you. She looked at him across the kitchen table, across the remains of the frittata, in the morning light that made everything look slightly more manageable than it was. I'll need something to wear, she said. That isn't this. Something shifted in his face, the suggestion of something that had once been a smile and was slowly, carefully, remembering how. That can be arranged, he said. She picked up her fork. Then we have a plan. She didn't tell him the rest of it, the part she'd been thinking through since the car ride, since the piece about the timing that didn't fit. Lorenzo had moved before she'd refused the offer. He'd assumed her refusal. He'd known she would say no, which meant someone had told him who she was, not just her financial situation, her character, her stubbornness, the specific quality of her refusal to be bought. Someone had told Lorenzo that Clara Mitchell would say no, and the only people who had known she was attending the gala that night were the people at the service. She set that piece aside, filed it in the same place she filed the letter from the bank, the cold coffee, the tear in the silver gown. Not forgotten. Waiting. 3 weeks was enough time to understand who she was dealing with. 3 weeks was also enough time for Lorenzo to realize that Clara wasn't retreating, wasn't broken, wasn't gone, and to decide what to do about it. She thought about that too. She thought about it while she washed the dishes with her sleeves pushed up, while Rosa came in and made a sound of approval at the frittata pan, while the morning opened itself up and became a day that had to be survived like all the others. And she thought about the moment at the Winter Gala, 3 weeks away, when she would walk into a room full of people who had seen her as a target, and they would have to look at her again. What they saw this time was going to be different. She was going to make absolutely sure of it. Across the kitchen, Alessandro watched her wash dishes with the stillness of a man recalculating something. And whatever the calculation was, the answer was making him look at her the same way he'd looked at her the first time, on the dance floor, when she hadn't yet understood what she was walking into. Like she was something he hadn't accounted for. Like that was starting to become his favorite problem. The morning after the winter gala, Clara woke at 5:15 and lay in the dark of the guest room for exactly 40 seconds before she got up. Not because she'd slept enough. She hadn't. Maybe 3 hours, broken. The kind of sleep that leaves you technically rested and functionally raw. She got up because lying there with her eyes open in the dark was worse than moving, and moving was something she knew how to do. She dressed in the clothes she'd worn the day before the gala. Jeans, a sweater, practical. Because her options in the Versiani building were limited, and she'd stopped caring about that weeks ago. She washed her face. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and noted, with the clinical detachment of someone taking inventory, that she looked like a person who had held her hand out to a man with a gun the night before. Pale, tight around the eyes. The specific hollowness of someone who has spent adrenaline they didn't have. She went to the kitchen. Alessandro was already there. This was no longer surprising. In the 3 weeks she'd been in the building, she'd arrived in the kitchen first exactly 4 times. Every other morning he was already at the table with his coffee and his phone and whatever reports he was reading that she wasn't technically supposed to read, but that he no longer angled away from her when she came in. She'd taken that as a form of trust, the same way she took his silences as a form of presence. You learned to read Alessandro in the margins. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the night before. The specific quality of attention that happens when someone has watched you do something they didn't think was possible and is still processing the data. "Sit," he said. "I made eggs." She sat. He put a plate in front of her. Scrambled eggs, slightly overdone at the edges. The work of a man who had learned the technical process of a thing without the intuitive feel for it. She ate them without comment because they were food and she needed food, and because making a remark about egg technique after the night they'd had seemed like a misallocation of energy. He sat across from her with his own plate, and they ate for a few minutes without speaking, which was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. He didn't fill silence out of discomfort. He left it alone until there was something worth putting in it. "Lorenzo's still in the ground floor room," he said. "I know." "The council convenes at 2 this afternoon. Caruso moved it up." He took a drink of coffee. "The gun changes what they're deciding." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her steadily. "How are you?" It wasn't a performative question. He asked it the way he asked everything that mattered, directly, with the expectation of an honest answer rather than a polite one. "I'm functional," she said. "Ask me again tonight." He nodded once. That was sufficient. Neither of them reached for more than that, which was its own kind of fluency. She was washing the plates. She always washed the plates. It was a compulsion. The kitchen had to be in order before anything else could be in order. When his phone went. She heard the shift in his voice within the first 5 seconds. Not alarm. Something below alarm, something colder. "When?" he said. A pause. "How many?" Another pause, shorter. "Don't move anything until I'm there." He ended the call and she turned from the sink and looked at him, and he was already standing, already reaching for his jacket on the back of the chair. "What happened?" she said. "One of my distribution warehouses in Red Hook," he said. "Someone went through it last night, between midnight and 4 a.m., based on the security log gaps." He was moving toward the door. "I need to go." "Was it Lorenzo?" she said. He stopped, turned. "Lorenzo was in the ground floor room last night." "I know, I said Lorenzo. Not Lorenzo personally." The look on his face shifted, the rapid internal recalibration of a man updating a model. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's what I'm going to find out." "I'm coming with you," she said. "Clara, you said we were in it together." She was already drying her hands on the kitchen towel. "That was 12 hours ago. The position hasn't expired." He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. The 3 seconds in which she'd learned he made most of his real decisions, quickly, on information already gathered, with the minimal visible process of someone who'd done it enough times that the machinery had become interior. "Stay close," he said. "Do exactly what Marco tells you." "I always do exactly what Marco tells me," she said, which was approximately 40% true, and he knew it, and they both moved. The warehouse in Red Hook was a 40-minute drive in the morning traffic, and Clara spent most of it watching Alessandro work his phone, calls going out and coming back, brief, information-dense, the language of people who communicated in shorthand built from years of working the same problems. She caught fragments. She built the picture from them the way she'd learned to build things from partial information. Her father's recipes when a page was smudged, her bakery's finances when a quarter was missing data, Alessandro's world when she had only edges. Someone had known where the warehouse was. Someone had known the security rotation. Someone had known the gap, the specific 40-minute window between the East camera's automated reboot and the guard's return from his perimeter check that created the vulnerability. Someone with inside information. The warehouse was a low building near the water, unremarkable from the outside in the way that buildings designed to be unremarkable always were. Alessandro's car pulled into the loading dock and Marco was already there, and two other men Clara had learned to identify by face without knowing their names, and a fourth man she didn't recognize who had the careful posture of someone delivering bad news and waiting to see how it landed. She stayed close to Marco as instructed. Marco was the most competent person in any room he entered, including rooms with Alessandro in them, and she had established this as a fact in the first week and operated accordingly. They went inside. The warehouse was organized, or had been organized. Whatever had been taken wasn't obvious from looking at it, and she understood that the things stored here weren't things you could identify by looking at an empty shelf. Alessandro walked the perimeter of the main floor with the unnamed fourth man, asking questions in a register too low for her to catch. Marco stood with her near the center of the space. "What was here?" she said to Marco quietly. Marco looked at her with the expression he used when deciding how much to say. "Records," he said finally. "Physical records. Ledgers." She absorbed that. "Financial. Among other things." "Someone took the paper trail," she said. Marco said nothing, which was also an answer. Alessandro came back. His face was the controlled version, the surface unmarked, but she was 4 months into learning him and she could see the tension in the way he held his jaw, the specific tightness of someone keeping a very large thing very contained. "The gap in the security log," he said to Marco. "Run it against every employee with knowledge of the rotation, including people who knew the rotation 6 months ago and no longer work here." "Already started," Marco said. Alessandro looked at Clara. He didn't say anything for a moment. The warehouse was cold. The heating was inadequate for the size of the space, and the morning light came through high windows in flat winter angles and turned everything gray. "The records that were taken," he said. "If they reach the wrong hands, and by wrong hands I mean specific people who have been looking for leverage against this operation for a very long time, they create a significant problem." "How significant?" she said. He looked at her. "The kind that doesn't resolve cleanly." She held his gaze. "Lorenzo knew about this place." "Yes." "He couldn't have sent someone last night. He was contained." "He has people," Alessandro said. "He's had 30 years to accumulate people. The question is whether he made calls before the gala, before the council stripped him, before he came to the building, and set this in motion as a contingency, something that would run regardless of what happened to him." Clara thought about what she'd said to the council the morning after. The difference between what Lorenzo is and what he did. She thought about it differently now, with the cold of the warehouse and the missing ledgers and Alessandro's contained expression between her and that thought. "He planned for losing," she said. "Even before the gala, he built something that would run if he lost. It would be consistent with how he operates," Alessandro said. "He doesn't gamble unless the odds are engineered, including the odds on his own failure." She thought about the bet, the research, the phone call before she'd even refused, the fire already set before the offer was made, the architecture of it, every contingency accounted for, every exit mapped. Lorenzo had never been reckless. That was the thing she'd misread. He'd been deliberate cruelty masquerading as impulsiveness, because impulsiveness was deniable and deliberate wasn't. "He has a contact inside," she said. "Not just someone who knew the rotation 6 months ago, someone current." Alessandro looked at her. "The gap was specific," she said. 40 minutes. That's not something you know from being in the building. That's something you know from watching the building regularly. Someone gave him the window." She held his gaze. "And if Lorenzo built this as a contingency before the gala, that means the contact was in place before the gala, which means whoever it is has been in place for weeks." The silence in the warehouse had a different quality now. Marco was looking at her. The unnamed fourth man had gone still. Alessandro said to Marco, without looking away from Clara, "Full internal review, everyone? No exceptions. That's going to be uncomfortable, Marco said. Yes, Alessandro said. Do it anyway. The drive back to the building was quieter. Alessandro was in his head. She could see it, the interior processing of a man reorganizing a landscape that had shifted. And she let him be there because that was what the situation required, and because she had her own reorganizing to do. She thought about the inside contact. She thought about the specific knowledge required, not just the security rotation, but the location of the physical records, the layout of the storage, the value of what was there. That wasn't general knowledge. That was operational knowledge. The kind that took time to accumulate, or the kind that was given by someone who already had it. She thought about the woman at the dating service, the junior administrator who had handed her file to Lorenzo, the person who had made small compromises for small rewards without thinking about the end of the chain. She thought about chains. She was thinking about chains when the car stopped and Marco said very quietly, "We have a situation." She looked up. They were 1 block from the building and a car was double parked outside. Black, substantial, the kind of vehicle that belonged in this neighborhood but not in this spot at this hour. And 2 of Alessandro's exterior security were standing with 2 men she didn't recognize. The posture of all 4 of them, the specific posture of people who are being careful about how tense they appear. Alessandro was already on his phone. She heard the words, "Who are they?" before his voice dropped below her register. Marco said, "Stay in the vehicle." "Who are they?" Clara said. "People who are not here with good intentions," Marco said pleasantly, as though he were describing the weather, and got out of the car. She stayed in the vehicle. For 4 minutes, she sat and watched through the tinted glass while Alessandro and Marco spoke to the 2 unknown men, while the exterior security stayed in their precise positions, while the double-parked car sat with its engine running. At 2 minutes, she had identified the shape of the conversation. Not hostile, not yet, but the kind of non-hostility that was maintained only through effort from all parties. A negotiation disguised as a greeting. At 4 minutes, Alessandro came back to the car. He got in and closed the door and said, without preamble, "They're from the Carbone family, out of Queens." She knew the name. She'd learned it during the 3 weeks of preparation for the gala. One of the significant families, old money in the criminal sense, long relationship with the Versiani name that was neither alliance nor opposition, but something more complicated than either. "They know about the warehouse," she said. He looked at her sharply. "That's why they're here this morning," she said. "Someone told them. Or they were waiting to see if it happened, and now they know it did." Alessandro's expression tightened. "They're asking for a meeting, today. Caruso will be there." He paused. "They're asking about the records." "What about the records?" He looked out the window. "Specifically, whether certain records that were in that warehouse document transactions that include the Carbone family's involvement in specific operations. And whether those records are now..." He stopped. "No longer in my protection." She understood the architecture of it now. Complete. Lorenzo hadn't just taken records to create leverage against Alessandro. He'd taken records that could expose the Carbone family, that could expose multiple families. And the Carbone family knew it, and they were here at 9 in the morning because they needed to know whether Alessandro still controlled the situation or whether everything had just become catastrophically worse. "Lorenzo wanted them exposed," she said. "Not just you, all of them. If those records reach anyone outside this world, law enforcement, press, anyone, they don't create a problem for me alone," Alessandro said. "They create a problem for every family that's done business through this operation in the last 20 years. "He built a bomb," Clara said, "and set it to go off when he lost." Alessandro said nothing. "He loses his standing, he loses his family, he loses everything," she said. "So he sets it up so that when he goes, he takes everyone with him. That's..." She stopped. He wasn't trying to survive. He was trying to make sure that his losing cost as much as possible. She thought about Lorenzo in her room, the gun on the floor. She thought about what she'd said to the council. A decision made with incomplete information is a bad decision. She had been wrong about one thing. Lorenzo hadn't been out of ideas when he came to the building. He'd already deployed his last idea. The building was the performance, the gesture, the visible piece. The warehouse was the actual play. "The meeting," she said, "with the Carbone family and Caruso. What do they want from you?" "They want the records back," Alessandro said. "Or they want proof that whoever has them won't use them. Or they want..." He stopped, jaw tight. They want to know that I'm in control of my own house. And are you? He looked at her. The question wasn't rhetorical, and she hadn't meant it as an attack. She meant it the way she meant questions in the kitchen. Practically, specifically, because the answer changed what came next. I'm going to be, he said. Then tell me what you need, she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the back of the stationary car, 1 block from the building, with Marco outside and the Carbone family's vehicle running and the morning going on being the morning. I need to find whoever gave Lorenzo the security rotation, he said. I need to find where the records are before Lorenzo can get them to wherever he's planned to send them. And I need to walk into a meeting in, he checked his watch, 4 hours and make the Carbone family believe I have both of those things handled even if I don't yet. The meeting is the easy part, she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly, which was his version of surprise. You know how to manage a room, she said. You've been doing it your whole life. Buy time in the meeting, use the time to find the records. She paused. The inside contact, that's harder. People don't give themselves away until they have a reason to. Then I give them a reason, he said. She looked at him. How? I tell them we found something, he said slowly, the idea forming as he said it. She could hear it, the specific cadence of a thought completing itself in real time. Not what we found, just that we found something, and I watch what moves. Who moves? She said. Who makes contact with Lorenzo's people when they think we're closing in? Yes, he said. That requires someone to watch, she said. All of them, simultaneously. Marco, he said. Marco is one person. Marco has people. She sat with this for a moment. What do you need from me, specifically? He looked at her steadily. Specifically, I need you to be in that meeting this afternoon. Not as someone I'm protecting, as someone the Carbone family sees beside me as a choice, not a circumstance. You want them to read me as a partner, she said. I want them to read you as someone I trust completely, he said, which is accurate, which means it won't require performance. She thought about the winter gala, the burgundy gown and the necklace and the council's room, the round table, what she'd said to Lorenzo. She thought about what it cost. Okay, she said. He nodded. The meeting is here. Ground floor, 2 o'clock. What do I wear? She said. The corner of his mouth moved. Whatever you wore to the gala. I'm not wearing the gown to a 2 o'clock business meeting. The necklace, he said. Wear the necklace. She looked at him. It communicates what I need communicated, he said, without either of us saying a word. She thought about his grandmother's necklace at the back of her neck, the weight of the stones, the women who'd worn it before her and what they'd walked into and whether they'd known, going in, what it was going to cost. Fine, she said. They went inside. The internal review that Marco ran through the morning was not subtle and was not designed to be. Every person connected to the warehouse operation was contacted, questioned, accounted for. Clara wasn't present for most of it. She was in the kitchen, making bread, because the bread needed to start the night before, and she'd started it the night before on autopilot, her hands moving through the familiar sequence while her mind was somewhere else. And now the bread needed finishing, and finishing it was something she could do while the rest of the morning happened. She shaped the loaves and listened to the building. At 11:30, Marco came into the kitchen. She knew from the way he moved. Not running. Marco never ran, but with the compressed efficiency of someone carrying urgent information to the right place. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her, and she set down the dough. Tell me, she said. Security analyst, Marco said. 3rd year with the operation. His personal phone showed contact with a number we tracked to Lorenzo's secondary network at 9:17 last night, 40 minutes before the warehouse window opened. She absorbed this. He was in place before the gala. 3 months before, Marco said. Small payments, sporadic, designed to look like consulting income if anyone looked at his bank records. He paused. He's downstairs. She wiped her hands on the cloth. Alessandro knows. Alessandro is with him now, Marco said. She started toward the door. Miss Mitchell, Marco said. She stopped. Alessandro asked me to... He paused, choosing the word with the care she'd come to expect from him. Inform you before you went down. Not to stop you, to inform you. So I know what I'm walking into, she said. Yes. What am I walking into? Marco was quiet for a moment. A man who made small bad choices for a long time and is now at the end of them. She went down. The room where the security analyst sat was not the same room where Lorenzo had been kept overnight. It was on a different side of the ground floor, a room that was used for things Clara hadn't asked about and Alessandro hadn't offered to explain. The man sitting in the chair was in his 30s, dark-haired, with the look of someone whose fear had passed through the acute stage and settled into something more sustainable and more terrible, the flat, resigned quality of a person who has run out of road. Alessandro was standing, not looming. He didn't need to loom, the room arranged itself around him without any help. But still, watching the man with the specific attention he gave to things that required absolute clarity. The man's name, she'd gathered from Marco, was Reyes. He'd been with the operation long enough to be trusted, not long enough to understand what that trust actually meant in terms of what was expected in return. He looked at Clara when she came in. His eyes moved to her and then to Alessandro, and she could see him recalibrating. Who is she? Why is she here? What does her presence mean? And she watched him do it and said nothing. Alessandro looked at her briefly, not asking her to leave, acknowledging her presence. "Mr. Reyes," Alessandro said, returning his attention to the man in the chair. "I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to understand that the accuracy of your answer determines what happens next." He said it without raised volume, without theatrics. "The way you state a fact." Where were the records being taken? Reyes's jaw worked. He was holding himself together with the effortful tension of a man gripping something that kept trying to come apart. "I don't know exactly," he said. "I gave the window. That's all I gave." "To who?" "A contact. I never met him in person. Everything was by—" "The contact's name," Alessandro said. "I don't know his real name. I know a number and a handle." "Give them to Marco." Reyes looked at Marco, who had appeared in the doorway behind Clara. He recited a number and then a string of characters that meant nothing to Clara, but that Marco wrote down with the concentrated attention of someone to whom it meant a great deal. "Why?" Alessandro said, the single word. Not what did they offer you, not how much, not the elaborate version, just why. Reyes looked at his hands. "I have a brother," he said. "He's in a situation, a debt. The contact offered to handle it if I provided access information. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought it was a one-time thing. One window, one time, and the debt goes away." Alessandro was quiet. "It was never going to be one time," Reyes said, and the way he said it made it clear that he'd known this, probably had known it at the beginning, and had chosen to act as though he didn't know because the alternative was finding another solution, and the other solutions were harder. "I know that. I knew it." Clara stood in the room and looked at this man and thought about chains again, about the administrator at the dating service, about small choices that feel isolated and turn out to be links, about how Lorenzo had been so good at finding people who needed something and offering them just enough of it to get what he wanted, and how the people he found were never entirely innocent and never entirely culpable, and were always, in the end, the most costly casualties because they were the ones who'd made it possible. She thought about herself, standing in the Plaza Hotel in a borrowed dress. She did not feel sorry for Reyes, but she understood him, which was different, and understanding him made the whole architecture more visible and more ugly than it had been. "The records," Alessandro said. "Where would they have been taken, based on the contact's pattern? Your best assessment." Reyes looked up. "He talked about a property in New Jersey, once. He mentioned it accidentally and then moved past it. I didn't register it at the time, but He stopped. "An address, I remember part of it. I can write down what I remember." Marco produced a pen and paper. Reyes wrote. Alessandro took the paper, looked at it, handed it to Marco without looking away from Reyes. "Verify this." Marco left. The room was quiet. Reyes sat in his chair and Alessandro stood and Clara was near the door, and the three of them were in the particular silence of a situation that had moved through its active phase and was now in whatever came after. "What happens to me?" Reyes said. "Not scared, resigned." Alessandro looked at him for a long moment. "That depends on what Marco finds at that address," he said, "and whether what you've given us is accurate." "It's accurate," Reyes said. "Then we'll talk again when we know what's there." He turned and walked to the door. Clara moved with him, and they went into the corridor, and he closed the door behind them, and he stopped and looked at the wall for a moment, the specific pause of someone doing rapid internal accounting. "The address is real," she said. "He knows where they are." "I think so," Alessandro said. "Then the meeting at 2 is the performance, and the address is the actual move." He looked at her. "I need people at the New Jersey property before 2. Before the Carbone family arrives, before anyone who might be watching understands that we've found the location." "How long to get there?" she said. 45 minutes. It's 12:10 now." "I know." She looked at him. "Go," she said. "I'll be in the meeting at 2. He looked at her steadily. "The meeting? I know what the meeting is," she said. "I know what you need me to do in it. I'll do it." She held his gaze. "Go get your records." Something in him settled. The specific settling of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has been handed a reason to set half of it down. "Marco stays with you," he said. "Marco always stays with me." He nodded once. He reached out and touched her face, brief, deliberate, the specific gesture of a man who doesn't make gestures without meaning them. And then he was moving down the corridor, and she stood and listened to his footsteps and the sound of the exterior door, and then silence. She went back to the kitchen. The bread needed to come out. The meeting at 2 o'clock was in the main ground floor conference room, which Clara had never been in, but which turned out to be a room that understood its own purpose. Large table, minimal decoration, the kind of space that was built for conversations where every word carried weight and no one needed reminding of it. The Carbone representatives were 2 men, older, the gravity of people who had been in this world long enough to wear it lightly. Caruso arrived separately, independently, which communicated something about the nature of the gathering that Clara could read even without a map. She stood with them in the room, and she wore the necklace, and she sat to the right of Alessandro's empty chair, and she waited. Alessandro arrived at 2:03. He came in from the side door, not the main entrance, and he sat and he looked at the 2 Carbone men and at Caruso, and he said without preamble, "The records are secure." The room shifted. "The individual who facilitated access to the warehouse has been identified and is being managed," Alessandro said. "The location where the records were being held has been confirmed, and my people are retrieving them now. By this evening, they will be back in my protection." The older of the 2 Carbone men leaned forward slightly. "You're certain?" "I'm always certain before I say something in this room," Alessandro said. Clara sat with her hands on the table in front of her, still, visible, the necklace at her collarbone, and she looked at the 2 Carbone men with the expression she'd used in the council room. Not aggressive, not deferential, the expression of someone who is present because they have earned their presence and knows it. The older man looked at her. "And the woman," he said. "We've heard about the events of last night." "Miss Mitchell is here because I want her here," Alessandro said. "Those 2 facts are the complete answer to whatever question you're constructing." The man looked at Alessandro, looked back at Clara, made a decision that was visible in the small rearrangement of his posture. "Lorenzo," he said, "the council's decision stands?" "Unambiguously," Caruso said, "and his attempt to leverage the records. This was his construction." "His final one," Alessandro said. The room moved through the next 40 minutes at the pace of careful men doing careful work. Clara spoke twice, once when the older Carbone man asked her directly about the events of the gala and the night that followed, which she answered with the same plain accuracy she'd used in the council room, and once when a question arose about the warehouse security that she had a specific answer to, having been present for the conversation with Reyes. Both times, Alessandro said nothing while she spoke, not deferring, trusting. There was a difference, and the Carbone men noticed it, and she watched them notice it and recalibrate their assessment of what she was and why she was in the chair. By 3:15, the meeting had resolved. Not completely. There were things that would require follow-up, conditions, the ongoing maintenance of a precarious equilibrium. But the immediate crisis had been acknowledged, addressed, and contained sufficiently that the Carbone men left without the specific weight they'd arrived with. When they were gone, Caruso stayed. He looked at Clara for a long moment across the table. "You testified at the first council," he said, "and the second." "Yes," she said. "You were in the building when Lorenzo came through the passage." "Yes." And you're here now. He looked at Alessandro. She's not going anywhere. No, Alessandro said. Caruso made a sound that was not quite approval and was definitely not disapproval. Your grandmother, he said to Alessandro, nodding at the necklace, would have found her acceptable, which is the highest compliment I know how to give on her behalf. He left. The room was quiet. Clara let out a breath that she'd been managing for approximately 4 hours. It came out slow and even, and she felt the release of it in her shoulders and her jaw and the specific muscles at the back of her neck that had been locked since she'd walked into the conference room. Alessandro looked at her from across the table. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, just the slight opening of something that had been held. He turned the phone toward her. A message from Marco. 3 words and a location. Records recovered. Intact. She looked at it, then at him. He looked like a man who had not slept in 36 hours and had just received the first piece of genuinely good news in 4 months. And the combination of those 2 things on that face, the exhaustion and the relief, was the most human she had ever seen him look. She stood and walked around the table. She stood in front of him, and he looked up at her from where he sat, and she put her hand on the side of his face, the same gesture he'd made in the corridor before he left. Brief, deliberate, meaning what it meant. He reached up and covered her hand with his eyes closed, just for a moment. The specific closing of a person who has been watching everything for so long that 30 seconds of not watching feels like being allowed to breathe. She left her hand there. Outside, the afternoon moved toward evening. The city went on being what it was. Somewhere in New Jersey, Marco and his people were securing paper records in a building that Lorenzo had arranged as his endgame, his last move in a game he'd engineered specifically to survive his own defeat. And it had not worked, and that would be dealt with in the weeks that came next. The implications, the cleanup, the careful rebuilding of what had been exposed. But that was later. Right now there was the room, the quiet, the weight of his hand over hers and his eyes closed and the necklace at her collarbone and the knowledge, solid and specific, that they had moved through the worst of it and were still standing. She thought about the morning, the eggs slightly overdone, the warehouse in the winter light, Reyes and his brother's debt and the chain of small choices that had led to the chair in the ground floor room. She thought about Lorenzo somewhere in the building or somewhere beyond it now. She didn't know exactly where he was and realized she'd stopped tracking it, which was itself a kind of change. She thought about what Caruso had said. Not going anywhere. No, she thought. She wasn't. Alessandro opened his eyes. He looked at her from close range, the specific proximity of 2 people who have stopped maintaining the distance that had been there at the beginning. And whatever he saw in her face made the last of the controlled surface come down, just briefly, just in the privacy of this room with the door closed and the meeting over and the records recovered and the long day nearly finished. Clara, he said, just her name. The way he'd said it the night of the fire, in the elevator, when he was in motion beside her before she'd processed that he was coming. The way a name sounds when it means more than a name. I know, she said. He took her hand from his face and held it. They stayed like that for a long moment. Not dramatic, not resolved, 2 people in a room at the end of a very hard day holding on to the simplest true thing available. Through the window above them, the last of the afternoon light shifted and began its long, slow lean toward evening, and the city moved, and somewhere across the river the record sat in Marco's careful hands, and in the ground floor room Reyes sat with his accounting, and in whatever room Lorenzo occupied the consequences of 30 years were settling like sediment after a storm. And here in this room, the 2 people who had walked through the center of all of it were very still and very present and not going anywhere. The phone buzzed again. Alessandro looked at it, read it, set it face down on the table. Marco says the full inventory matches, he said. Everything that was taken is accounted for. Good, she said. It'll take a week to process the full implication of what Lorenzo intended. I know. There will be more meetings. More management. I know that too, she said. Alessandro. He looked at her. We can talk about the week of meetings tomorrow, she said. Tonight I'm going to cook dinner in your kitchen and you're going to eat it and we're going to sit at that table and not talk about any of this for at least 2 hours. She looked at him steadily. That's what's happening. He held her gaze for a moment. Then, what are you making? Something with pasta, she said. I'll decide when I see what's in the refrigerator. The corner of his mouth moved. There's very little in the refrigerator. There never is, she said. I always manage. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. He stood. They walked toward the door together, and she was already thinking about the refrigerator inventory and the pasta options and whether there was enough good olive oil, and he was already on his phone managing the first of the week's worth of management that awaited, and they moved through the corridor side by side, close enough that their arms occasionally touched, and neither of them moved away from it. At the elevator, she pressed the button, and they waited, and in the waiting, the quiet settled around them again. The Versiani building's particular late afternoon quiet, the city at a distance, and she stood in it and felt, for the first time in 4 months, the specific quality of a moment that did not require surviving, just living in. The elevator arrived, the doors opened. They stepped in, and the doors closed, and the building held them, and they went up. The pasta was rigatoni, because that was what was in the cabinet, and the sauce was built from what the refrigerator actually contained. Canned tomatoes, 2 cloves of garlic that were still firm, olive oil that was good enough, dried oregano, half an onion that had been there for 4 days but had not yet crossed the line. Clara cooked the way she always cooked when she needed to think, with her full attention on the process and the thinking happening underneath it, in the part of her mind that worked best when her hands were occupied. The garlic went into the oil first. The sound of it, the specific sizzle of garlic hitting oil at the right temperature, not burning, not underdone, was the most normal sound she'd heard in 4 months, and she stood over it and let it be normal for a full 30 seconds before she added the tomatoes. Alessandro was at the table. He had his phone, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at her, and she was aware of the looking the way you're aware of light. Not intrusive, just present, a warmth in the peripheral. You don't have to watch, she said. I know, he said. She stirred the sauce, the kitchen filled with smell, and the city pressed against the windows, and the evening settled around the building like a thing that had been waiting all day for permission to arrive. Clara thought about Reyes in the ground floor room, about the records in Marco's custody, about the week of meetings that waited, the careful dismantling of everything Lorenzo had set in motion, the accounting that would take longer than a week and would require things she didn't fully understand yet and would learn. She thought about the necklace, which she'd taken off when she came into the kitchen and set on the counter beside the ceramic rooster, which had been brought to the building by Rosa 2 weeks ago, because Rosa had said that the rooster needed to be somewhere with food smells, or it would get depressed. And Clara had not argued because arguing with Rosa about the emotional states of ceramic birds was a losing proposition. The 2 objects sat side by side, the old necklace and the old rooster. And Clara looked at them while she waited for the sauce to reduce and thought about what it meant that both of them were in this kitchen, in this building that was not hers and was becoming, gradually and without formal announcement, somewhere she recognized. What are you thinking about? Alessandro said. She looked at him over her shoulder. The rooster, she said. He looked at the rooster. The ceramic one. Do you own any other roosters? No. Then, yes, the ceramic one. He looked at it for a moment. It's very ugly, he said. My father bought it at a flea market in 1987 for $2, she said. He thought it was funny. Then it stayed on the counter for 40 years because neither of us could figure out how to get rid of it without it feeling like a statement. She turned back to the sauce. Now it's survived a fire. It gets to be wherever it wants. Alessandro was quiet for a moment. Your father would have... You were going to say that yesterday, she said. I stopped you. I know. Say it now, she said. If you want to. He was quiet for a moment longer, then, he would have found this situation deeply improbable. She laughed. It came out before she could decide about it. A real laugh, brief and startled, the kind that happens when something is unexpectedly accurate. She turned and looked at Alessandro, and he was watching her with the expression that had become her favorite of his expressions, because it was the one he couldn't produce on purpose, the unguarded one, the one that happened when something caught him off guard in a direction he hadn't defended. Yes, she said. He absolutely would have. She finished the sauce. She cooked the pasta properly, salted water, the right temperature, pulled 30 seconds before the package said, because the package was always wrong. And she combined them in the pan the way her father had taught her, with a splash of pasta water and a patience for the emulsification that most people skipped because they didn't understand why it mattered. She put the bowls on the table. They ate. It was not a dramatic meal. It was a Tuesday evening meal, the kind built from cabinet inventory and necessity, and it was very good in the way that simple things made correctly are very good. Alessandro ate with the full attention she'd given up trying not to notice, the way he ate everything she made, like it was information, like it was worth decoding. Halfway through, he said, "There's a hearing." She looked up. "Not a council hearing," he said. "A formal legal one. The city has been building a case against certain operations for the last 18 months. The case involves records." He looked at his bowl. "Records that were in the warehouse." She set down her fork. "The case was supposed to have enough to proceed without the warehouse records," he said. But Lorenzo's original plan, before he decided on the contingency, before he set the warehouse move in motion, his original plan was to give those records to the city. Not to destroy my operation, to trade my operation for his own immunity. She was very still. "He had a contact," Alessandro said, "in the city's legal apparatus. The contact was waiting for the records. When Lorenzo lost his standing at the council and the warehouse move was activated, the records were supposed to reach the contact within 48 hours. Marco's people got there in 6, she said. "Yes," he said. "But the contact knows the move was attempted. The contact knows Lorenzo tried to deliver and something went wrong. And the contact is now—" He stopped, proceeding on the assumption that the records may still surface. Clara looked at him across the table. The kitchen was warm, the sauce smell was still in the air. The rooster sat on the counter beside the necklace, and the city was outside, and everything was very ordinary and completely not. "How serious?" she said. "Serious enough that I need a lawyer who is not the one I currently have," he said. "Serious enough that some of what has been built will need to be restructured, legitimized in the parts that can be, dissolved in the parts that can't." He said it with the same directness he used for everything. "The records Marco recovered include documentation of things that I would prefer remain undocumented. Their recovery means they're in my control again, but the contact knows they exist, and the contact has a long memory and a mandate." "You're telling me this now," she said. "You said you wanted to be in it with information," he said. "This is information." She held his gaze. "What's the timeline?" "Weeks," he said. "Maybe less." He picked up his fork, then set it down again. "I want to be clear with you about what this could mean, for the operation, for my exposure." He looked at her steadily. "For anyone who is visibly associated with me." "You're warning me," she said. "I'm being accurate," he said. You said you preferred accuracy. This is the accurate version of what we're walking into." She looked at the table for a moment, at the bowl of pasta, at her own hands. She thought about the loan document in her coat pocket in the guest room, signed by both of them, with the repayment schedule and the terms and the legal precision of a man who kept his word by writing it down. She thought about the bakery in its current state. Walls standing, kitchen operational, front window rebuilt, display cases arriving Thursday. She thought about the woman who had walked into the Plaza Hotel 4 months ago with no power and no protection and nothing between her and the bank's timeline except a borrowed dress and a practiced smile. She had not been safe then. She had just been alone in her unsafety. "You're not telling me anything that changes my position," she said. "Clara?" "You're not," she said. "The position is, I'm in it, with information. The information is more complicated than I knew a week ago. My position is the same." She looked at him. "What I need from you is not protection. I need you to tell me what I can do that's useful, specifically, the way you always tell me things." He looked at her for a long time. "The bakery," he said finally. "If there's a legal process, they'll look at everyone in my orbit. The loan is documented," she said. "Terms, repayment schedule signed. It's a legitimate business loan from an individual to a small business. My lawyer. And yes, I have a lawyer. She's 70 years old and has handled commercial bakery law in Brooklyn for 40 years and is absolutely terrifying. Can document it fully." Something moved in his face, the almost surprise. "You consulted a lawyer about the loan." "Week 2, she said. "I told you I wanted it documented." "I thought that was Alessandro." She picked up her fork. "I grew up in a bakery. My father taught me that you write down every transaction, you keep every receipt, You document everything because memory is fallible and good intentions don't survive audits. She looked at him. I have been operating on those principles my entire adult life. What did you think was going to be different? He stared at her. Eat your pasta, she said. He ate his pasta. The corner of his mouth moved, and she didn't look at it directly, but she felt it in the specific way she'd come to feel his expressions, as information, as warmth, as the ongoing evidence of a person becoming more visible to her and less defended. They did not talk about the legal situation for the rest of the evening. They talked about other things. The bakery layout. She'd been going back and forth about the placement of the second display case, and he had, characteristically, a precise opinion about traffic flow that turned out to be correct when she thought it through. Rosa's return date, which Rosa had communicated to Clara via a series of texts that were technically words, but functioned more like marching orders. The morning delivery schedule, which needed to be rebuilt from scratch because the old suppliers had moved on, and the new ones required relationship building that Clara was going to have to do personally over the next month. Normal things. The weight of them was not small. Normal was a thing you rebuilt, one conversation at a time, from the material of what remained. Alessandro washed the dishes. She stood beside him and dried them, because drying dishes was a two-person job if you did it correctly, and they stood at the sink side by side with their arms occasionally touching, and the water running and the evening going on outside. And it was the most domestic scene she had been in since her father was alive, and she felt the full weight of that without looking away from it. At 10 o'clock, he said, "You should sleep." "So should you," she said. "I have calls," he said. "You always have calls. Tonight especially." She dried her hands. She looked at him in the kitchen light, the tiredness still visible in the lines around his eyes, the shirt still not fully buttoned from the morning, the man underneath the structure of everything she'd learned about him present and visible in a way it hadn't been 4 months ago. "Alessandro," she said. He looked at her. "The legal situation," she said. "Whatever happens, I want you to tell me as it develops. Not managed. Not the version that's been edited for my comfort." She held his gaze. "The actual version. Every time." "It might be difficult," he said. "I'm aware of what difficult is," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. "Every time," he said. She nodded. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Clara," he said. She went to the guest room and she lay in the dark, and she listened to the building and thought about chains and choices and the specific texture of deciding that a complicated thing is worth the complication, and then she slept, and this time she slept well. The week that followed was the hardest week she'd had since the fire, and the fire had been very hard. The legal process Alessandro had described moved faster than he'd anticipated. The city's contact, understanding that the records had been recovered and that the warehouse move had failed, did not wait for a more favorable moment. The first formal inquiry arrived at Alessandro's legal team on a Thursday morning. Not an indictment, not yet, but the official shape of one becoming visible. Alessandro's new lawyer was a woman named Holt, who had spent 25 years doing things in courtrooms that most lawyers didn't know were possible, and she arrived at the Versiani building on Thursday afternoon with 2 associates and a rolling case, and the specific energy of someone who had been waiting for an interesting problem. Clara was not in those meetings. She was clear-eyed about the boundaries. There were parts of this world she was not equipped to navigate and didn't pretend to be, and the legal machinery was one of them. She stayed in her lane, which was the bakery and the kitchen, and the daily visible proof that she was exactly what the loan documentation said she was, a small business owner in Brooklyn with a commercial loan from an individual and a repayment schedule that her lawyer could paper in her sleep. She went to the bakery every day. The construction was in its final week. The kitchen equipment had been installed, better than what she'd had, as Alessandro had said, which had initially bothered her and then stopped bothering her when she turned on the convection oven for the first time and understood what better actually meant. The display cases went in on Thursday. The signage arrived on Friday. Mitchell's Patisserie, the same dark green letters, slightly more precise than her father's hand-painted version, but close enough that Rosa looked at it for a long time without saying anything, which was Rosa's form of approval. On Friday afternoon, Holt came to the bakery. Not for legal business. She came in her coat, without the associates, and she stood in the rebuilt front room and looked around it with the eyes of someone who saw things clearly and was deciding what this thing was. Nice, she said. Thank you, Clara said. The litigation, Holt said without preamble, because Holt did not use preambles, is going to be extended. The city has a case, but it has gaps, and the records they hoped would fill the gaps are not in their possession and are not going to be. That changes the shape of what they can build. She looked at Clara. Alessandro's exposure is real but manageable. The restructuring we're implementing will take 3 to 4 months and will result in a significantly different operation, smaller, more exposed to daylight, which is actually better for everyone except the people who preferred the dark. Is he going to be all right? Clara said. Holt looked at her steadily. Define all right. Not arrested, Clara said. Not in a situation he can't get out of. He's not going to be arrested, Holt said. The situation he's in is the kind you manage, not the kind you escape from. He'll be managing it for a long time. She paused. He's good at managing things. I know, Clara said. Holt looked around the bakery again, at the display cases, the rooster on the counter, the rebuilt window. You're opening when? She said. Thursday, Clara said. My mother used to take me to a bakery like this, Holt said, in Carroll Gardens, before everything changed. She said it without sentimentality, just as information, the way she said everything. There aren't many left. No, Clara said. There aren't. Holt left. Clara stood in the finished bakery in the Friday afternoon light and breathed. The following Tuesday, Lorenzo's final accounting arrived, not the council's accounting, that had been delivered and was being enforced. This was the other kind. Lorenzo, absent from the Versiani building, absent from his standing, absent from everything that had defined him, had sent a message through Caruso's office. Not to Alessandro, to Clara. Marco brought it to her at the bakery. A folded piece of paper, handwritten. She held it without opening it for approximately 30 seconds, standing behind the new display cases with Rosa visible in the kitchen doorway, watching with the expression of a woman who had seen too much of life to be surprised but was paying close attention. She opened it. The handwriting was different from what she'd imagined, not the controlled script of someone performing authority, but something smaller and more effortful, like a hand that had lost the habit of writing things that were true. It said, I was wrong about what you were. I'm not sure I know how to be sorry for something this size, but I know I was wrong, nothing else. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and stood at the counter of her father's bakery and thought about what it cost to write 7 sentences when you'd spent your whole life performing instead of meaning. She thought about Reyes and his brother's debt, about the administrator at the dating service, about all the links in the chain that had ended improbably here, in a rebuilt room with a ceramic rooster and display cases full of her father's recipes in winter light through the original window dimensions. She thought about whether she forgave Lorenzo. She decided that forgiveness was too large a word for what she had, and what she had was more specific. She understood how he'd built himself into the person who'd sent the letter. She could hold that understanding. She didn't need to call it anything bigger. She put the letter in the waterproof case with her father's notebooks. It belonged in there, in the record of things that had been difficult and had not broken her. The night before the opening, Clara couldn't sleep. She was in the guest room at 11 p.m., and then at midnight, and then at 1 a.m. And at 1:15 she got up and went to the kitchen, because the kitchen was where she went when she couldn't sleep, had always been where she went. From the age of 7, when her father had found her at the bakery counter at 2 in the morning, and instead of sending her back to bed, had put her to work on the morning prep, and explained that some people were built to work at night, and that wasn't a problem, it was just information about yourself. Alessandro was at the kitchen table. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. He was in the clothes he'd been wearing earlier. He'd been up, she understood, not unable to sleep but working, the late calls and the ongoing management of a situation that didn't have office hours. The pasta's gone, he said. I know, she said. I finished it at lunch. I could call someone. It's 1 in the morning, she said. No one is being called. She went to the cabinet and found the ingredients for something simple. Eggs again, bread, the good olive oil. Sit. I'll make something. You don't have to. Alessandro. She turned and looked at him. I'm awake, and I need to do something with my hands, and you're here. This is what happens. He sat. She made eggs and toast, the simple version, the one that required no technique but came out right if you paid attention. She paid attention. She thought about tomorrow. The 5:30 alarm. Rosa already in the kitchen by the time she arrived. The morning prep. The window display. Mrs. Giraldo third in line. She thought about all the mornings that had led to tomorrow. The ones in her father's kitchen, watching his hands. The ones alone in the bakery after he died, learning to run the thing by herself. The ones in the Versiani kitchen, cooking for a man who'd needed to remember what real food was. She put the plate in front of Alessandro and sat across from him with her own. "The hearing is set for 3 weeks from today," he said. "Holt told me it was manageable," she said. "It is," he said. "Manageable doesn't mean easy." "Nothing manageable is easy," she said. "That's why it's called manageable and not easy." He looked at her. "Are you worried?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said, "but not about the outcome. I'm worried about the months in between, about what it costs you to go through it." She met his eyes. "That's different from being worried about whether we come out the other side." "You're certain we come out the other side," he said. "Yes," she said simply. He held her gaze for a long moment. "I'm not certain of things the way you are," he said. "I calculate probabilities. I assess variables. Certainty is—" He stopped. "Certainty is not something I've been able to afford very often." "I know," she said, "but I am certain about one thing," he said. She waited. "You," he said. "I'm certain about you." She looked at him across the kitchen table at 1:30 in the morning, in the light that turned everything the color of something old and honest, with the eggs between them and the city outside and the opening of her father's bakery She checked the clock. 4 hours and 15 minutes. She thought about the Plaza Hotel, the borrowed dress, the practiced smile. The moment she'd decided to take Alessandro's arm and step onto the dance floor, not because she wasn't afraid, but because standing still was worse. She thought about all the ways she'd said yes in the past 4 months without using the word. "Alessandro," she said. "Yes. I'm going to say something and I need you to just listen first and not calculate it." He set down his fork. "All right. I fell in love with you somewhere between the frittata and the fire," she said. "I'm not sure of the exact moment, which is irritating because I like knowing exact moments, but it was in there somewhere." She looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you now because the bakery opens tomorrow, and whatever comes next with the legal situation and the restructuring and the months of managing, all of that is real, and I'm not pretending it isn't. But I'm also not going to carry this around like a variable I haven't accounted for. It's a fact. I wanted you to have it." The kitchen was very quiet. Alessandro looked at her with the expression she didn't have a name for and then did. Recognition, the same as the dance floor, the same as the warehouse morning, but completed now, fully arrived. Not the suggestion of a thing, but the thing. He said, "I told Caruso something after the first council convened." She waited. "He asked me why I'd intervened at the gala," he said. He'd heard the full account by then and he wanted to understand my reasoning. Whether it was strategic, protecting the family from Lorenzo's exposure, or something else. He looked at her. "I told him I'd seen a woman being used as a target in a room full of people who should have known better, and I couldn't walk out of that room and go on being who I was if I left her there." She didn't say anything. "He said that sounded personal," Alessandro said. "I told him it was the most personal decision I'd made in 20 years. He held her gaze across the table. "I didn't have a word for it then. I have one now." She felt it in her chest. Not dramatically, not the explosive version that stories used because it was easier to render. The quiet version, the one that settles rather than detonates. The one that feels like something you've been carrying finally finding the right place to be set down. "Good," she said. "Is that all you're going to say?" he said. "No," she said, "but the rest of it can happen after the eggs." He looked at her. The real smile, the full one, the unguarded one, the one she'd seen twice before and filed away like something rare, came and stayed this time, and it changed the room the way actual things change rooms, by being in it. She ate her eggs. He ate his eggs. The night finished itself around them. The city going on being the city, the clock moving through the small hours, the building settling into its 3 a.m. quiet. They stayed at the table longer than the food required, talking about the things that needed to be talked about, and some things that didn't need to be talked about but were worth saying anyway. And at 3:15, Clara said she needed 2 hours of sleep minimum or the morning pastry quality would suffer, and that was non-negotiable. And Alessandro said he would be at the bakery by 11, and she said, make it 10:30 because he was always late, and he said he had never once been. And she went to the guest room and she lay in the dark, and she smiled until she fell asleep. The opening morning was everything that Rosa had ordered it to be, and slightly more chaotic than any of them had planned for, which was the correct amount of chaos for an opening day, and which Clara's father had always said was a good sign. A perfect opening means no one came, he'd said once, and she'd thought he was joking until she'd understood he wasn't. The line was out the door by 8:15. Not just Mrs. Geraldo and the neighborhood regulars, though they were there. People who had seen the sign go back up and had told someone, and that someone had told someone, and the specific grapevine of a place that had been missed doing what grapevines do. 2 women from the building association. The owner of the wine shop 2 blocks over who had sent a card when the fire happened. A family with 3 children who'd moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago and had never been to the bakery before and were now, based on the expressions, going to be regulars. Rosa ran the kitchen with the precision of a military operation. Clara ran the front. The register worked. The display cases held. At 10:47, Alessandro came through the door. Not 10:30. She made a note of this and filed it in the category of battles for another day. He stood inside the door, and the room took him in. A few people glanced, the way people glance at someone whose particular quality of presence announces itself. And he looked at the full cases and the line and the light and Clara behind the counter, and something happened in his face that she caught from across the room and held on to. He crossed to the counter. She handed him the coffee before he reached her. He took it. He looked at her across the counter in the busy, warm, flower-smelling room, and he said, very quietly, "It's right." "I know," she said. He looked at the honey cake in the case. "First day rule," she said, and cut him a piece and put it on a plate and slid it across the counter. He picked it up. He looked at it for a moment, at the color of it, the texture, the thing that 40 years of her father's careful notes in the margins had made possible. "Your father's recipe," he said. "Yes," she said. He ate it at the counter. She watched him eat it between serving the next customer and the next in the gaps of the morning, and she thought about what he'd said the first time, "The best thing I've eaten in 20 years." And she thought about how far that sentence was from the man who'd stood at the top of the plaza stairs 4 months ago, assembled for maximum effect, the king of a world that didn't know what a real meal was. He was different. She was different. The room was the same room her father had built, and it was not the same room at all. Both of those things were true. At noon, when the morning rush had settled into the gentler rhythm of lunchtime, Clara came around the counter for the first time and stood beside Alessandro, who had taken a stool near the end where he was out of the way, and they stood together in the room while Rosa emerged from the kitchen with the expression of someone who has just confirmed a hypothesis she'd been testing for months. "The honey cake is gone," Rosa announced. "All of it," Clara said. "I'm making another batch at 2, Rosa said. "And someone needs to call the supplier about the almond flour because we have enough for 3 days and the order doesn't arrive until Thursday." She looked at Alessandro. "You." She pointed at him. "You have people who handle logistics." Alessandro looked at Rosa. "I do," he said. "Then your people can handle this logistics," Rosa said, and went back to the kitchen. Clara looked at Alessandro. He looked at her. "I'll call Marco," he said. "Marco handles supply chains for almond flour now," she said. "Marco handles whatever needs to be handled," Alessandro said. "That's his job." She thought about Marco's expression when he learned about the almond flour and felt something approaching delight. The afternoon passed the way good afternoons pass, with work, which is its own reward when the work is yours and is real. Clara restocked twice. She talked to every customer who wanted to be talked to and gave quick, efficient service to the ones who didn't. She answered 3 questions about whether the bakery was going to have a full cafe menu. "Not yet," she said, "maybe by spring." And 1 question about whether they did wedding cakes, which she said yes to even though she hadn't yet decided, because the woman asking had a look on her face that Clara recognized. Someone who needed something to be possible. She told her yes because it was the right answer, and she'd figure out the logistics later. At 4 o'clock, Alessandro came to find her in the kitchen, where she was going over inventory with Rosa. "I have to go," he said. "Calls," she said. "The first of the pre-hearing conversations," he said. "Holt wants me present." She wiped her hands on her apron and walked with him to the front room. The afternoon light was coming through the rebuilt window at the angle she'd anticipated. The angle her father had known when he placed the original window, the southeast-facing glass that caught the winter sun in the late hours and turned the display cases gold. He stopped at the door. He looked at the room one more time. At the cases, depleted from the morning, still beautiful in the afternoon light. At the rooster on the counter. At the new ceiling and the old tile and the sign outside in the dark green letters. "He would have liked me," Alessandro said. Not a question, not quite a statement. Something between them, an offering. Clara looked at him. "My father," she said. "He would have made you earn it. He didn't like anyone easily." She looked at Alessandro steadily. "But yes, eventually. He would have liked you." Alessandro looked at her. The small private thing moved through his face and settled. "I'll be at the building by 9, he said. "I'll be here until 6, she said. "Come by if you finish early." "Mitchell's patisserie closes at 6, he said. "The bakery closes at 6, she said. "The kitchen closes when I decide it closes." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached out and touched her face. The same gesture as the corridor, brief and deliberate, and meaning exactly what it meant. And he said, "Save me the last piece of whatever's left." "I'm not promising anything," she said. "Rosa controls what's left." "And I'll negotiate with Rosa," he said. "Good luck," she said. He left. The door closed behind him. The afternoon continued. Rosa appeared at Clara's shoulder. "He's going to be trouble," she said. "I know," Clara said. "The good kind," Rosa said, and went back to the kitchen. Clara stood behind the counter of her father's bakery in the late afternoon light and looked at the room, the rebuilt room, the surviving room, the room that had burned and been made again into something that held the original shape and was not the same as the original, and was better for being both. She thought about the Plaza Hotel and the borrowed dress and the practiced smile. She thought about how far that night was from this afternoon, measured not in months but in the things that had changed, the specific gravity of becoming someone who knew what she was walking into and walked in anyway. She thought about the necklace, at home on the Versiani building's kitchen counter beside the ceramic rooster, the two objects that had no business being beside each other and were. She thought about her father, the way he'd talked about a bakery, the daily argument. She understood it differently now than she had at 26, standing in the room after his death, trying to figure out how to keep it going. She understood that the argument wasn't with the world. It wasn't a statement made into the air, hoping someone was listening. The argument was with despair. The daily, renewable, necessary argument that something warm was still possible, that a room could hold it, that bread and honey cake and the smell of butter in a hot oven were not small things, were not background things, were in fact the evidence, available to anyone who walked through the door, that ordinary life was worth the cost of building it carefully. She understood that now. She picked up the cloth and wiped down the counter. The last customers of the afternoon came through, and she served them, and the light moved across the floor in the slow gold way of winter late afternoons, and the city went on outside. And inside the room was warm and full of the smell of everything her father had built, and she had rebuilt, and Alessandro had helped rebuild, and Rosa had never stopped believing would be rebuilt. At 5:50, Rosa came out of the kitchen with her coat on and a container of honey cake in her hands. "For him," she said, setting it on the counter. "From me, not from you. I'm not making it easy for either of you." "He has to negotiate for it," Clara said. "He knows where I live," Rosa said. "He can come to Queens." She buttoned her coat. "Lock up properly. Set the new alarm. Call me when you're home." "I will," Clara said. Rosa looked at her for a moment. The full look, the 73 years of it, the weight of someone who had known Clara since she was 16 years old, standing in her father's kitchen, not knowing yet how much she would have to carry. "He'd be so proud of you," Rosa said, quiet, just for Clara. Clara held very still. "I know," she said. Rosa left. The door closed. Clara stood alone in her father's bakery for the first time since the fire, in the quiet that comes at the end of a good day. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of completion. The room settling into itself after all the morning's work and afternoon's warmth. The display cases mostly empty, the new floor clean, the rebuilt window holding the last of the light. She stood behind the counter and she looked at the ceramic rooster, and she thought about her father buying it at a flea market in 1987 for $2 because he thought it was funny. She thought about 40 years of mornings in this room. She thought about the fire and the notebooks and the silver dress and the dance floor and all of it, the whole improbable chain of it, that had led from the letter in her apron pocket to here. She reached out and straightened the rooster slightly. It had been listing to the left. There. Better. She took off her apron and folded it and set it on the counter, and she picked up the container of honey cake Rosa had left, and she locked the door of Mitchell's patisserie behind her, set the new alarm Alessandro's people had installed, and stood on the sidewalk in the winter evening. The bakery was behind her. The city was ahead. Somewhere across it, Alessandro was in a room with Holt, managing the next thing in a long sequence of things to be managed. Somewhere in Queens, Rosa was on the train, calculating how long before the almond flour situation became her problem. The world was its complicated self, exactly as it had always been. She started walking. Not toward the Versiani building, not yet, just walking, the way she used to walk after long shifts when her father was alive, letting the city process through her, letting the movement do what movement does. The cold was a clean cold, the kind that makes things feel more distinct, and she walked with the container of honey cake under her arm and her coat buttoned and her eyes forward. She walked past the spot where the wine shop owner had sent the card, past the corner where the luxury condos had gone up and changed the neighborhood's center of gravity, past the street where the artisan bakery with the minimalist interior had opened and taken her customers, and where, this morning, she had seen the Mitchell's patisserie opening posted in their window, a small handwritten sign that said, "Welcome back, our neighborhood is better for it," which had made her stop and stand for a moment and feel something uncomplicated and clean. She walked until the cold had cleared whatever had needed clearing, and then she turned and walked back. The Versiani building's lobby was warm. The night staff nodded. The elevator was waiting. She went up. The kitchen light was on. She set the honey cake on the counter beside the rooster and the necklace. And she put the kettle on, and she sat at the kitchen table in the quiet building, in the city that was always moving, and she waited for whatever came next. The kettle began to warm. Outside, the night settled over everything. Over the bakery with its new sign and surviving rooster. Over the warehouse in Red Hook where Marco's people had been. Over the Plaza Hotel where it had started. Over the rooms where Lorenzo was learning what a smaller life felt like. Over all of it. And here, in this kitchen, a woman who had walked into a room 4 months ago with a practiced smile and walked out the other end of something entirely different, sat with her hands around a warm mug and knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who has paid for every conviction they hold, exactly where she was. She was home. Not the building, not the bakery, the specific geography of having people who would come back. She was home, and she was waiting, and the kettle sang, and the night was long, and all of it was exactly enough.